afternoon, everybody. We hope that everyone is enjoying this nice day out, and we are going to go ahead and get started. If everyone is ready, we want to be respectful of everyone's time, and so please feel free to, if there's others from your organization that want to join, please tell them to get on, but we will go ahead and get started. So thanks for everyone who's here today. My name is Dr. Gina Ginn, and I will be facilitating our conversation today. I am the CEO for Columbus Early Learning Centers and a proud member of the Columbus Women's Commission. I chair, along with Veronica, our Gender Equity in the Workplace Committee, and I'm very excited to join all of you today from the Hilltop Early Learning Center, which is one of the jewels of our city here in Columbus. A large component of gender equity is pay equity. And at the Columbus Women's Commission, we understand that pay equity and equal economic standing are critical to overall prosperity in our community. Equitable economic standing comes from an equitable workplace, and we continue to work towards pay equity. And there are many facets in pay equity and the journey to pay equity in a company. Employers have a crucial role in creating equitable work environments and starting pay. And that starts with pay. The Columbus Women's Commission continues to lead in efforts to achieve pay equity. The Columbus Commitment is a voluntary employer-led pledge to close the wage gap and achieve pay equity for working women in our community. As of March 2023, over 370 local employers have signed the pledge and are examining their practices to address equity. Signing the Columbus Commitment opens up employers to a network of other businesses and organizations who are also committed to pay equity. When an employer joins this network, resources are available from many types of different organizations and sources to provide diverse perspective on how to achieve pay equity, along with many other topics. The endeavor towards pay equity is also one we cannot do alone. It will take every one of us working together and supporting one another to achieve pay equity in Columbus. Pay equity isn't only paying your employees equitably, but also reducing biases and creating transparency about the decision behind the pay of each employee. When we promote clarity within our organization, we can identify where inequities lie and work to remedy those disparities. While recognizing and resolving our imperfections can be really uncomfortable sometimes, these conversations are often the most important ones to have. We cannot move towards progress if we are not willing to have these difficult conversations. It is our willingness to identify our shortcomings and improve in ways that we can exhibit this as our strengths. The experts and employers joining us today will guide us through their pay transparency journey and what a potential pay transparency journey may look like for you. We will begin our conversation today with the legislative landscape, and Councilmember Lourdes Barroso de Padilla will review the salary history ban and discuss some upcoming pay transparency legislation that she has been working very hard on and is championing with City Council. We will then hear from subject matter expert Nicole Armstrong about the steps you can take to implement pay transparency practices in your organization. And we'll round off today's webinar with employers sharing their lived experience with pay transparency and implementation. So now I'd like to hand it off to Council Member Lourdes Barroso de Padilla, and we're excited to hear from her.
Good afternoon, everyone. We don't have the council member with us quite yet, so we are going to pass it to our subject matter expert, Nicole Armstrong. Nicole, if you would like to introduce yourself, and thank you for being here.
You think after multiple years of the pandemic and being on a video that I would remember to unmute myself, but it's a journey, isn't it? But it's lovely to be here with you all this afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about a subject that I am incredibly passionate about, and I know you all are as well. So happy to dive in and talk about pay equity and pay transparency. I'm going to start my video. Let's see here if we can pull this up. All right, here we are. Hopefully y'all can see this. Are we good on the tech side, Emily? Is this showing up okay?
It is. Thank you.
Perfect. Awesome. Just wanted to make sure before we dive in. So just to reintroduce myself, my name is Nicole Armstrong. I'm the founder and CEO of Eloquate. Happy to be here with you today to talk about how we establish equitable and transparent pay practices, because in theory, it makes a lot of sense. In practice, it can be a little bit confusing. So we're going to dive into that today. But the one thing I want to talk about before we get into sort of the details of how we do this work is that, I want to address pay and equality from a broader spectrum, right? So oftentimes when we think about equity in the workplace, we initially think of the gender pay gap or the racial pay gap, right? And we're going to explore that further today to better understand why pay inequality is actually a symptom of a much stickier social challenge, and why pay equity requires more than simply paying people in the same roles the same wage, just as we heard from Gina earlier. So one of primary reasons for the pay gap is what we call occupational segregation. There's a variety of reasons for the pay gap, but one that we're going to talk about today is what we call occupational segregation. And this occurs when one demographic group is disproportionately represented across and within occupations. So there's actually two types of occupational segregation that I want to cover. The first is what we call the vertical segregation. So that refers to segregation by level. So this is also described sometimes as the glass ceiling, when you have certain groups who are disproportionately represented in entry-level or mid-level jobs, and other groups who are disproportionately represented in leadership and executive level roles, right? So that is what we call vertical segregation. So for example, there are a lot of women employed as nurses and home health aides, but they're often underrepresented as managers in healthcare. And we can see the same in education. So over 74% of our teachers are women, but only 26% of our superintendents are women, right? Now, the second type of occupational segregation that's important to understand is called horizontal segregation. Now, this is where women and men or different groups do different types of work. So think different sectors, for instance. You can actually see in this chart that the highest paying jobs in the US are dominated by men and the lowest paying jobs are dominated by women. And research by the Washington Center for Equitable Growth shows that occupational segregation occurs most often because of the assumptions that we make about the types of work that's best suited for people based on identities like gender or race. So before we dive in, I want to do a quick activity. I want everybody at home to close their eyes. I'm going to list a few professions, and I want you to take note of the first image that comes to your mind. Okay, everybody got their eyes closed? So the first profession, ballet dancer, construction worker, hotel housekeeper, CEO. Okay, you can open your eyes. So oftentimes when we do this activity, there's an image that pops into our brain right away, right? More often than not, when I mention ballet dancer, people see a woman, right? They imagine a woman, and oftentimes it's a white woman. Maybe not in your case, but most often than not, it's a woman. For construction worker, it could be sort of a burlier man, a larger gentleman who might be working as a construction worker. For hotel housekeeper, we often hear that it's a woman, sometimes a Latina woman or a Hispanic woman. And for CEO, more often than not, people report that the image that popped into their head is a white man. Not always, but most often. So what this demonstrates is this is part of our social programming, right? Like our brain is always making these connections. And these sort of social norms that are programmed often influence the choices that we make, including like the job or the career we might choose to pursue. But that notion of occupational segregation doesn't actually take into account all of the factors that contribute to the pay gap. So even though folks might move into specific directions, it doesn't necessarily account for all of the reasons that we see such a wide pay gap. And it's really tempting to believe that if we could just get more women into high paying, male dominated jobs, we can close the pay gap. I'm sure you're all familiar with the movement to get more women in STEM, for instance, which in and of itself is great. But actually, a study of more than 50 years of data reveals that when women move into male dominated fields in large numbers, wages actually decline for the same exact jobs that men were doing before, even when we control for experience, skills, education, race, and geographic region. And the reverse is also true. So when men move into female dominated fields in large numbers, the pay actually increases. Computer programming is a perfect example, right? The majority of computer programmers in the 1940s were women. It was considered a more administrative job. As more men moved into the field, the value of those roles increased, the pay actually increased. And what's interesting is that in occupations dominated by men, they typically pay better than occupations dominated by women, even when the jobs require the same level of education and skill. So it's not that women are picking lower paid jobs. It's that we actually, as a society, value jobs less when they're filled by women. And so what happens is we end up with a gender pay gap in 94% of our occupations, according to the National Women's Law Center. In 2023, the gender pay gap actually widened by race and ethnicity. And this was in part because the real median earnings increased for white men substantially more than it did for other groups. And so the pay gap actually widened a bit in 2023. And we found that women were paid less than men for full-time work in all of the 20 largest occupations for women and in all of the 20 largest occupations for men. And you can actually see here in this graphic the intersection of gender and race and how that actually influences the median earnings of people across the board, right? So we know that Latina women or Latinx women earn the least compared to their white counterparts, white male counterparts. Now, what we know is that pay equity is critical, right? Not just for economic prosperity and self-sufficiency, but we also know that there's a clear connection between pay equity and employee well-being. And we're going to explore that a little bit today. We know that pay gaps contribute to depression and anxiety, particularly among women and marginalized groups. And we also know that chronic stress-related health disparities among ethnic, racial, and other marginalized groups has been linked to perceived discrimination. So not only is it an economic imperative, but for the health of your workforce, it's also critical that we get pay transparency and pay equity right. And so we wanted to dig at Eloquate a little bit further into this to understand how perceptions around pay practices can impact employee well-being. Gina mentioned a little earlier around transparency and communication and how important that really is. And I think what our data shows is that it's critically important to well-being. So we analyzed our data, which included over 6,000 survey question responses that represented employees from over 40 organizations in the for-profit, nonprofit, and governmental sectors. And what we found was that a lot of employees do not understand how their pay and other forms of compensation are determined, right? There is a lack of transparency and communication there. In fact, nearly 30% of employees overall do not understand how their pay is determined. And we see a slight increase for folks with marginalized identities, like people with disabilities or LGBTQ plus employees. We also, when we look at the intersection of gender and race, we see that about a quarter of men, both white and BIPOC standing for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, don't understand how their pay is determined, but we see a slight uptick for white women and specifically for BIPOC women as well. So what happens is when we don't understand how pay is determined, when we don't understand compensation practices, we often don't believe that they're fair. And that's what we see here in this data, right? So 20% of employees overall do not think that their pay is fair compared to others with similar roles and responsibilities in their organization. And we see a pretty significant increase when we look at some of the historically marginalized groups within this data. So a quarter of our BIPOC employees don't feel that their pay is fair, 33% of people with disabilities, and 31% of LGBTQ plus employees. When we look at the intersection of gender and race, we see a significant difference between white men and BIPOC women in feeling that their pay is fair. And this has a really significant impact on employee well-being. When employees understand how their pay is determined and they perceive their pay as fair, they are much more likely to see themselves working at their employer in 2 years' time. So, this can have a really significant impact on retention, but they're also more likely to feel like they belong at their employer and they're more likely to be satisfied with their work life balance. On the other hand, when employees do not understand how pay is determined or they perceive their pay as unfair, they're much more likely to experience stress in the workplace that really impacts their personal life. And they're less likely to experience feelings of belonging and psychological safety. So, that impact on well being. Interestingly enough, we saw a disproportionate impact on people with multiple marginalized identities. So, when we look at Black women in particular, they're 2.5 times as likely to report that they cannot bring their authentic selves to work when they do not believe they are paid fairly. In the same token, 1.7 times as likely to report that they don't feel safe bringing up problems and tough issues at their employer. So, not only is pay transparency critically important in terms of communication and employee well being overall, but when it's not there, when there's a lack of transparency, it can have a disproportionate impact on your employees with multiple marginalized identities. So we know that pay transparency is really important for a variety of reasons. We know that it can help close the pay gap, but how do we actually move to implementing it, right? And how do we do that in a sustainable way? So I want to talk a little bit about pay transparency and some of its benefits. And this is really important to understand the both benefits and the drawbacks as we move forward in terms of implementation. So, research has showed that it does reduce pay inequity across gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and other dimensions. But we also know that if pay transparency initiatives reveal that an employer has been equitable and consistent in their pay, the productivity actually increases. So it has a much positive impact on employees, not just in terms of their well-being, but also in terms of their productivity. Now, the reverse is also true. So, if it's found that an employer has not been equitable, productivity can actually decrease. Now, there are a few main types of pay transparency. There's both internal and external, and then there's partial and full, right? And so, internal is exactly like it sounds, it's sharing salary ranges or pay information within the organization. This can be really helpful in fostering trust and clarity among employees. And then we also have external, right? And that's publicly disclosing salary ranges or information. This can be crucial in attracting talent and promoting fairness, but it can also save you and applicants a lot of time. It's really wonderful to know up front, is this salary going to meet our family needs? Should I apply to this job or not? Also, it's going to narrow down candidates that understand what that pay band is and they're okay with that. And so it helps you sort of save time both from the employee side as well as the employer side. Now, there's also partial and full pay transparency. So, partial pay transparency is when we share pay ranges for roles, but not for individual salaries. Full transparency is when we disclose individual salaries. Now, partial transparency can balance openness with privacy, which can be helpful if you're starting out. Full transparency does require complete openness, but it requires a really strong organizational culture to manage the potential challenges that can come along with that. Now, I also want to cover a little bit of the drawback of pay transparency. We know that pay transparency doesn't necessarily guarantee pay equity. Why is that? Well, in states that have passed pay transparency laws, we have seen some companies beginning to game those laws in a way, right? So when they are required to share compensation ranges in job postings, or they're required to share compensation ranges for internal transfers or opportunities, what we're seeing is some organizations are just widening the band to the point where it becomes meaningless, right? There was one instance where a company posted a job and said that the band was between $50,000 and $250,000, right? That becomes meaningless. That's not done with the intent of the law. And so even though it is maybe meeting the criteria, it's not helping us to achieve pay equity. We also know that with pay transparency can come some wage compression, and it's something to think about as you move in to really instituting pay transparency practices within your own organization. So, when employees have been with a company for a long time, they may only be receiving 1 to 3% increase. each year, depending on living wage increases, right? But comparatively, when workers switch jobs, they can receive up to a 20% increase or more. So that means that newly hired people might come in with higher pay packages, which can actually widen pay gaps. So it really requires employers to continually reassess the value of the roles in the organization to make sure that all employees are being paid fairly. Now, pay transparency, while it can close pay gaps, as we've just discussed, is really most effective when it's part of a larger commitment to pay parity. And we're going to focus on mitigating bias from recruitment all the way to retention, right? When we think about that horizontal segregation and that vertical segregation, we have to address this in a holistic way. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the pathway to parity, which includes 5 main steps. The first is understanding, knowing your why, right? Clarity. We're going to talk about having a clear compensation philosophy. Commitment, that's building more equitable systems to support your pay transparency practices. Capacity building, and accountability. So, step number 1 is really understanding, knowing your why. Anytime we move into a change process, anytime we begin to implement something new in the organization or explore a different approach, we need to understand why we're doing it. So when we think about pay transparency and our commitment to pay equity, we need to ask, how does promoting pay equity really align with our organization's values? And how is it going to help us achieve our goals? Having a clear sense of purpose and why is key so that we can move on to the next step, which is really defining a clear compensation philosophy. Now, when we're thinking about a compensation philosophy, what we're really asking ourselves here is, how does our compensation philosophy align with our values? What is our market, right? So we probably depend on this already. A lot of you will most likely be using external market data to think about your salary ranges. And that could include your geographic location, your industry, the revenue size of the organization, the number of employees, all those different factors that we consider. But probably the most important question we need to ask is, are we going to lag the market, match the market, or lead the market, and why? And the reason I ask that is that we talked a little bit about that occupational segregation in the beginning, how we devalue certain jobs because of the people that fill them, right? And so it's an important question to ask, when do we disrupt the market to right historical wrongs? Sometimes market value can perpetuate pay inequity. So we have to have a clear sense of why we're making certain decisions. And I'll use this example to kind of demonstrate this. We've worked a lot in the past with social service nonprofits, right? Oftentimes they employ social workers, oftentimes they are majority female workforce. But we also know that within those wages, oftentimes those social workers are making below a living wage. They're being paid market value, but the market devalues the work. And we can see this in a variety of occupations, right? So if our goal as an organization is to help build the community, to alleviate poverty, to maybe promote equity, because we're a nonprofit that's what we're committed to, but we pay our employees less than a living wage, we now have a disconnect between how we compensate our own employees and what the mission and vision of the organization is. So we have to bring that back into alignment through our compensation philosophy. So one of the biggest questions we need to ask is, do we need to disrupt the market to disrupt historical wrongs? Make sense? Once we have a clear sense of why we're making certain decisions around our pay, we can move on to redesigning our systems to support pay transparency, to really support and promote pay equity. And there's a lot of different ways that we can do this, but I'm going to focus on 5 today since we have some limited time together. We're going to talk about standardizing our compensation and how we do that, promoting pay transparency, mitigating bias in hiring, conducting a regular pay equity audit, and reducing bias in performance reviews. So when we think about the life cycle of the employee, from recruitment to retention. So when we think about standardizing compensation, it's really important to understand that when we standardize these practices, we're helping to mitigate cognitive biases. So for example, the anchoring effect. And there's many different cognitive biases that can influence our decision-making when we're hiring. So we want to mitigate as many as possible. We also want to avoid rewarding people who just happen to be really good negotiators, right? So these are the kinds of things when we think about standardizing our compensation, We need to think about what are the requirements for the role and how do we make sure that we're doing this in an objective way. This can also help us mitigate some of that wage compression we talked about, and it can allow us to sort of right some of those wrongs and avoid perpetuating the devaluation of certain roles that are predominantly held by women and BIPOC. Right? It also is really critical to providing clarity to our employees of how we're actually making pay decisions. So, what we always recommend is for every role within your organization that you have, think about developing a formula to determine the base pay for each role and how you want to reward additional attributes. So, for example, your base pay would consider the minimum skills and requirements needed to succeed in that role. And then you can kind of consider what are those additional attributes that would be helpful to that role to help that person succeed. They're not required, but it would be a benefit to the organization. That could be additional years of experience. It could be education or accreditations. It could be performance, although with the caveat that if you're going to include performance when you're considering pay, you need to ensure that you've mitigated bias in that performance review process, right? So having that standard compensation formula is really important. Once you have those formulas in place, once you have your philosophy, you understand how pay is being determined for each role, then we can begin promoting pay transparency. And this is where we really need to determine what kind of pay transparency is going to work for our organization. We talked about the external and the internal, right? If it's external, we might be including pay ranges or rates in all job postings. Some laws are actually going to require us to do this. If it's internal, sharing our compensation philosophy, our formulas, and salary ranges for each role with employees. And the key here is to make sure that we're communicating the what and the why, right? What are we doing? Why is it important? How is it going to affect me individually? Now, the reason pay transparency has become sort of a best practice, not only because of legislation, but we also know that employees are looking for this, right? 70% of professionals want to hear about salary in the first message from a recruiter, according to a LinkedIn study. And SHRM found that more than 80% of US workers are more likely to consider applying for a position if the pay range is listed in the job posting. So this is quickly becoming an accepted best practice. Once we have pay transparency, we want to make sure that we're mitigating bias in the hiring process. Now, there's a lot of different ways that we can do this, but here's a few quick tips that you can implement today. The first is making sure we're removing gendered language or biased language from our job advertisements. And there's some great online resources that you can actually drop your text and it'll tell you if you've got some biased or gendered language within your job posting. The second is to make sure we're expanding our recruiting sources, right? When we think about pay equity and we think of that vertical sort of segregation, we want to make sure that we have people in the pipeline that we're moving up through the organization. So making sure that we're expanding our recruiting sources. That can be by building relationships with historically Black colleges and universities. It could be disability advocacy organizations, second chance hiring organizations, you name it, whatever feels right for your organization, but really making sure that we are going to expand those recruiting sources. And the third and probably most important component of mitigating bias in hiring is really making sure we're standardizing the interview process. We know that structured interviews are far better at predicting performance than unstructured ones. It helps us mitigate unconscious bias even in gender-dominated industries, right? And what that means is that we have a really predetermined objective set of criteria that we understand are needed to succeed in the job, not nice to haves, but must haves. We also want to make sure we're creating a rubric of how we score different answers to the questions that measure those criteria. What does it mean to have a strong answer versus an excellent answer? We need to define that before we ever start the hiring process, right? I think I saw a request, Emily, let me see her. Repeat the stats from the previous slide, of course. So the stats from the previous slide for pay transparency. So 70% of professionals want to hear about salary in the first message from a recruiter, and 80% of US workers are more likely to consider applying for a position if the pay is listed in the job posting. So hopefully that answers that question if we missed that before. So now that we've mitigated bias in hiring and we have folks coming into our organizations, we want to make sure that our pay practices are creating the results and creating equity within the organization. And so we always recommend conducting pay equity audits. Now, the best way to do this, if you're an organization of over 50 employees, for example, is to use regression analysis. This is going to examine the relationship between pay and other variables expected to influence pay. So that could be years of experience, education, hours worked, but it's also going to look at identities like gender, race, role, right? Parental status, for example, to make sure that identities like that are not significant determinants of pay. Now, if you were an organization of less than 50 employees, regression analysis may not always work. What you'll really need to do there is be intentional about looking at each role. What are the minimum requirements? And going through with a fine tooth comb to make sure that there aren't any outliers, either above or below the pay range, that share different identities. So it's a little bit different process. If you're smaller, you can't necessarily use regression. But if you are large enough, we always recommend using regression analysis. This is going to help promote fairness and transparency. It's going to help you identify and address any pay disparities you may have, which can also help you mitigate legal risk. And a SHRM study also found that companies that proactively address pay disparities have much higher levels of employee satisfaction, commitment, and productivity. All right. So mitigating bias in performance reviews. This is the next step that we're going to jump into. So we want to make sure that we talked a little bit about mitigating bias in the interview process. We want to do the same thing as it relates to performance reviews. So making sure that we have that objective criteria. We often recommend co-designing some of those criteria with the employees themselves and making sure that we're engaging a diverse set of colleagues in 360-degree reviews on a regular basis, right? Not the yearly reviews, but at least quarterly touch points with our employees. We also want to make sure we're tracking promotion rates and promotion speed by gender and race, ethnicity, whatever other marginalized identities whenever possible, so that we can see if there's disparities in sort of the advancement of employees through our organization. So a couple of quick formulas that you can use is the employee movement rate. And so that's the number of promoted employees divided by the number of full-time employees. And you can do this for all staff, but you can also do it by each demographic segment you want to measure. And then promotion speed ratio, right? So the tenure of employees over the number of promotions that they've received. And you can do these on averages. So the average tenure of women over the average number of promotions women have received. Same thing for men. And you can start to see if those numbers are a little bit different and if there's challenges we might need to address within our organization. So once we've sort of redesigned our systems, the fourth step is capacity building, right? This is really building the muscle within our own organizations, developing those skills and behaviors, making sure that we have communications plans in place. Why do we want this change to happen? Why is it needed? How is it going to impact individuals? What are the new expectations of folks? Communication should always come from the top to make sure that it's communicated as a strategic priority, as well as from managers to their direct reports. We want to identify change champions. So there's always people in the organization who are going to advocate for these kinds of changes. You want to identify them. They're going to be the ones that have the relationships with employees who can help you problem solve when any challenges arise. And you want to make sure you're actively listening as you go through this change process, right? Schedule check-ins with employees, respond to feedback in a timely manner. And finally, the fifth and final step in thinking about implementing pay transparency and pay equity is accountability, right? We need to make sure that these are strategic priorities with trackable metrics. We don't know if we're accomplishing it if we don't know what we're trying to accomplish. So what are our KPIs and how are we going to measure them before and after the change process? So for example, if you decide, hey, you know what, we really need to expand our recruiting sources, we're going to build HBCUs in the region, our KPIs might be the number or percentage of job applicants that have attended or graduated from an HBCU. So just making sure that we're clear, how are we measuring whether or not we are successful? So I know that was a quick overview. Hopefully that was really helpful. I will check the chat and respond directly in the chat to any questions you all might have, but appreciate the time and being here with you today. Happy to answer any questions. You can ping me in the chat or you can scan and connect with me on LinkedIn. But at this point, I will hand it back over to Gina.
so much. That was incredibly helpful. And as a CEO of a nonprofit, I feel like you were speaking directly to us. So thank you so much for that information. I know that it will be very helpful to many of us. Now I would like to transition back over to Councilmember Barosa de Padilla, who has joined, and she is going to talk with us a little bit about the salary history ban and discuss some upcoming pay transparency legislation.
Gina. Nicole, thank you for that awesome presentation. That was so great. No matter how long you're in this game, there's always more to learn. And so I appreciate the thoroughness of your presentation, especially as folks think about how they can create change and pay equity within their organizations and the changes that can be made. For those of you I have not had the pleasure of meeting, I am Councilmember Lourdes Barroso de Padilla. I'm one of your Columbus City Council members, and I'm so excited to be here today to talk about an issue that is near and dear to my heart. Growing up, as a Latina in various industries, the pay gap was something that I experienced personally well before I came on to the Columbus City Council. And for more than a decade, I ran an organization now called ELLA, Empowering Latina Leaders Academy, formerly called Latina Mentoring Academy, where we trained professional Latinas. It was a professional development organization for Latinas in our community. And knowing that we were one of the groups that were most, when you look at the pay gap, which I'm sure you went through in the presentation with Nicole, we are one of the groups that were most adversely affected by pay inequity. And over the course of our lifetime, stood to lose over $1 million in earnings. And so this was an issue that I became even more passionate about leading this group, and knew that when I came into a role as a legislator was one of the first things that I really wanted to tackle. I believe firmly that there are two ways to create social change. First is changing minds and hearts, which is some of the hardest work that we have to do, and then really creating systems change that allows for equity in systems. And as you saw from Nicole's presentation, a lot of what we see when we think about pay equity is systemic. When we look at when women really entered the workforce in full force around the 70s, where we really started to take on different roles in the workforce outside of the home, we started to see where pay inequity started to, where it really kind of started, and then it has not. If you think about the 70s, so that's literally my lifetime, we've only closed the wage gap by about a quarter. And so all of the facts and figures that we come up with to really illustrate the pay gap, folks can point to, how we measure the pay gap, if that's real, if it's not real. I'm sure that every woman on this call, if they've gone through some sort of equity review within their own companies, they can point to the reality of the situation. All of this is to illustrate what we again know to be true, that this exists. It exists in industries, whether you are tenured, whether you have a college degree, whether you have multiple degrees or specialities. This is something that continues to affect women, people of color as a whole. And so the legislation that we introduced and passed last year here at the Columbus City Council for the city of Columbus was really our stake in the ground to say that this is still top of mind. This is still an issue, no matter if women are in the White House, if women are in boardrooms, if women are legislators. This is something that we continue to face. This is not something that has gone away. And that as a city, as we look at more than doubling our population growth in the next 20 some years, that we wanted to ensure that we were creating equity for our people here in Columbus, and that as businesses come to Columbus, they're truly doing not just business in Columbus, but the business of Columbus. And we wanted to illustrate our values. And so that's why we took the step of really putting this into legislation to ensure that there is equity within the system. And we can't let perfection get in the way of good, right? Nicole pointed to some challenges that other municipalities, other cities have faced when they look at pay transparency, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But we wanted to ensure that the spirit of what we are doing, that we are pushing equity forward, especially in a time where equity is top of mind for many corporations and people and systems, that we are indeed living those values and creating that equity. So the salary history ban that went into effect in March of this year during Women's History Month, and that was intentional. It was passed during Women's History Month, became law a year later during Women's History Month, to again have that top of mind. It will create pay equity for all people. While we certainly have been centered on women and the equity gap for women, this is ensuring that all people make more money by ensuring that there is a clean negotiation. So what we know, and you saw again in the presentation, is that if you are already underpaid and you come into a new potential opportunity and you are sharing where you started from, you're already starting at a deficit. So what the salary history ban really tried to get at was making a clean negotiation between a potential employee and a potential employer. So as I'm a job seeker going into the interview process, I cannot be asked what my previous salary was on the application or during the interview process. Our hope is what that means is that when I come to the table to negotiate my salary, I have a number in mind and the potential employer has a number in mind, and we can really negotiate where I am going to be paid. Because as employers, we know that we have a certain band, right? We know that somewhere within the salary we want to, or somewhere within this range, we can afford to pay for this work. And so we're not devaluing anybody, but what we are saying is we're actually fairly compensating you for the role or the employment or the job that we want you to be hired for. And so there are exceptions to this. We listen to our employers. We listen both to small business, large business, Fortune 500 companies. And we knew that because this was something that folks had to do in other markets, this was a simple change for them within our market for some of the bigger companies. And we knew that for some of the smaller companies, that this was going to be potentially a more aggressive change in terms of how they do business. We also knew that this was an industry best practice. There had been companies that have been doing this for 20 years, right, in our community. And so we could learn from them. So if folks want to visit salaryhistoryban.com, it is a website that we created that has both a toolkit for job seekers, it has a toolkit for employers, it also has some FAQs. So this law only pertains to companies that have 15 employees or more, because we knew some of our smaller companies that this created some challenges for them. We did not want to be punitive in our approach, but we really wanted this to be a learning process together and to be able to bring people along. So there is a mechanism for folks, if you have gone through a process and been asked this question, that you can begin to put employers on our radar. And by putting them on our radar, this means that we have a conversation with them. We say, did you know that this was a law that was put into place? Do you need help? Do you need technical assistance? Do you need us to provide you with other tools so that way you can start to use some of these best practices in your company? And what are the changes that you need to make? Now, along that path, if there are multiple instances where folks really aren't changing their behavior, changing their practices, then there is a modest fee that they have to pay. And part of that is, again, we did not want to be punitive, especially to our smaller companies, because we also understand, especially in the city of Columbus, that some of those smaller entities are actually owned by women, by people of color, by immigrants, migrants, or refugees. And so we wanted to ensure that we gave them time to change those practices and that we didn't make it so punitive to them that they could not, if they hadn't changed that, if there were barriers, that we could continue to work with them. So again, I encourage folks to look at the website that was put into the chat so that they can see what this legislation really means. You can read it there. You can look at it. You can look at the FAQs. You can reach out to my office at any time if folks have questions or thoughts about the salary history ban. Or if you need to file a complaint, there is a link there to also file a complaint. Because again, we want to ensure that we're bringing people along with us in this change. So the companion legislation to the salary history ban is that obviously, and this is what this webinar is about today, is that if we are going to ask, if we're going to ban something, then there needs to be transparency on the other end, right? So actually posting what the salary band is for a particular job. And again, this is an industry best practice. If you look at some of the major employment websites that are on, like Monster, like idealist.org, they're already requiring for people to put in those ranges. We are cognizant of what some of the challenges are, that there is a spirit of what this legislation is trying to do. We know that there will be folks who will find a way around it and they'll post, ridiculous. Nicole gave some examples of like $0 to $1 million and that sort of thing. We're taking that into consideration as we start the conversation with our community, our business community, our business owners, to say, what does this look like? What are some of the challenges? If you look at municipalities across the country, cities across the country that have put in a salary transparency legislation, it's looked a little bit different in every city because they've taken into account some of the both learning from other municipalities, but then also what are the unique challenges that their communities may be facing? What is the uniqueness of their city, whether it's because they're looking at growth or size or population, whatever it may be. And as we start this series of conversations with the community, they will be open conversations where folks can say to us, what are some of the potential barriers? What are the challenges? What are the good things about what it is that we're trying to do? That will help us craft a piece of legislation that makes sense for us. That, again, is a companion piece of legislation to the salary history ban so that we can ensure that everyone gets paid more money, that we are putting equity within a system to ensure that we're protecting our people and really living our values as a city. This is the start of a much larger conversation. Like I said last year, we are just getting started. We are going to continue to look at best practices. We're going to continue to look at other opportunities that we have to help inform, to help educate, and to help legislate best practices that will ensure that all of our families earn more money, that they can participate in the prosperity that is coming with our growth in the city of Columbus, and that we are truly putting our people and our families and our communities first. So thank you all for taking the time to be here. I want to thank my fellow commissioners at the Women's Commission for providing this opportunity. It is part of this is on us. Part of this is on us as job seekers, as women, to be confident, to have the tools and the knowledge that we need to advocate for ourselves, to advocate for each other. When we advocate for ourselves, know that you are helping the next woman next to you, beside you, behind you, because when we put value in ourselves, that raises all boats. That ensures that we're not undercutting anyone, that we're not undercutting each other. So the role that we have to play as individuals is just as important as creating system change, because again, that goes back to the mind and heart work. So thank you again. Please reach out to my office with any feedback that you have. I'm so glad to be here today and so glad to be partners in this work with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Council Member. We absolutely appreciate your time and are so glad you could be here with us today. So for those that are participating, we know that we are running a little short on time. So we are going to ask, we know that having practical examples of how pay transparency has been implemented in companies in our community is something that is very valuable. So we want to make sure that we have at least a couple of minutes to talk with our two esteemed colleagues who are here with us today about how their organizations implemented pay transparency. So Karim, if you could, Karim is here with us from Porter Wright, and Kim is here with us from AEP. Karim, if you could maybe just focus your answer to the question around what was the process Porter Wright used to implement pay transparency. If you could maybe take 2 to 3 minutes on how you implemented, and then if Kim, if you could then do the same, and then we will wrap up right about 12:59. So Karim, I'm passing it over to you.
Thanks, Gina. I appreciate the opportunity. And I really think our earlier presenters really did a great job summarizing the topic. I'm glad I've been invited to come back to the Women's Commission to give some insights on what we have done at Porter Wright. I think the easiest way of describing what I think we've done is we see pay transparency as one of the many stops on the road to developing a more engaging and inclusive work environment. And so that's been our goal. And we looked at pay transparency as one of the things we really had to focus on to get there. I will share one of our big obstacles, of course, is lawyers are famously known for being resistant to change and being very skeptical of shiny things. And also we've had years, I mean, long before me, of paying partners and or associates when we call lockstep. So lockstep sometimes bakes in bias based upon when a person started working at a place of employment. I think the first thing we thought about was coming up with a framework to think about this organizational change. And I will say we adopted a hybrid of the switch change management model from Chip and Dan Heath, where we were focusing on certain items, really thinking about how can we look at incremental improvement, set realistic, tangible goals, identify what our roadblocks would be, identify who will be our change champions to help pull these efforts over to the finish line, and figure out how to adapt to change. So with that in mind, I will tell you, one of the first things we did was we adopted the Columbus Commitment to Pay Equity probably 6, maybe 7 years ago. I can't remember exactly when, but that was like one of the first things we did. Another thing we did was we adopted we signed on to the Mansfield certification process, where, for those who don't know, Mansfield is a kind of legal profession focused effort to encourage promotion of historically underrepresented individuals in the legal profession, and in my case, at a law firm, by making sure when we are making decisions that we are making sure we are considering a wider range of people. What we really appreciated with that approach was, unlike what you often hear about in diversity inclusion, where people really focus on the platitudes that folks like to share, this was something that was very measurable. We could think through, okay, this makes sense. Are we considering 30% of our candidates for partner? Are they from a historically disadvantaged group? And I think having that framework and every year being able to say, how did we do, and have a measurable goal, it really helped us really focus our efforts just to figure out, okay, if we didn't, where are the challenges? What could we have done? And I think for the most part, we recognize that we certainly aren't where we want to be on this issue of pay equity. There's a lot that needs to happen. Some of the items were mentioned earlier about the hiring process. One of the things we started doing was standardizing our hiring process by developing specific competencies that we ask our interviewers to judge each candidate on. I mean, it's very easy to be able to say whether you can drink a beer with someone. It's very different to say, okay, are they hungry, humble, and smart? And if so, what's our criteria? What evidence do we have that they've demonstrated in this interview that they meet this criteria? That was a great secondary step. I think as I'm looking at our next step, based on what was been shared today, is we really need to be thinking about what we are going to do about standardizing our pay process. I mean, we are in the early stages of it. There are always challenges. Everybody wants to be paid a lot of money, but coming up with set systems with this is how we are going to pay associates and pay partners. Those are our two biggest pay expenses. So that's what I'm focusing on at the moment. But spending time being very transparent about what the criteria of payment is, the criteria that we're using to pay individuals is, I think, a great starting point for us. But I know there's more that we definitely need to do. Now, I could talk a lot longer. I know we have a time crunch, so I want to cede my time if I'm running out of it.
Karim, thank you so much. I will now turn it over to Kim Kaiser from AEP to have her share a little bit about their process. And then for those of you who are on the call, if you do need to jump off at 1 o'clock, or right now, we understand, but we are going to continue to keep going for a few more minutes. And so at the end or after this, we just wanted to let you know that we will provide some additional resources and opportunity for office hours and the next webinars that will be up and coming. But if you have not signed the Columbus Commitment, please consider doing so. And then we will be sharing this recording out. So Kim, thank you for joining us today. And if you could please share what AEP's process has looked like, or what process you may still be on the journey to pay transparency. If you could share a little bit with us, we'd appreciate it.
Sure, and I appreciate the time. I know I only have a few minutes here, so what I thought I would do is just focus on some of the unique things, or sort of unique things that I think AEP is doing. It was great listening to Nicole's presentation because I was thinking, yes, we're posting ranges, on postings and doing a bunch of the things that she was talking about. But some of the unique things that I'm particularly proud of that AEP does is we have online learning that's available on demand. We did this in person about 10 years ago when we were going through a complete comp redesign to make sure it's understanding pay at AEP, making pay decisions at AEP, so people can kind of understand what's the comp philosophy, what's the practices, how are leaders making decisions about merit increases and promotions. And all that information is out there there's employee versions, and then there's also leader versions. So we want to make sure that our population is very informed of, that we have practices that we stick to, everybody's treated the same, everyone's treated fairly. One of the other things that I think a lot of companies might not do is we share market data with our leaders. Now, that doesn't mean we just hand over our surveys, because anybody who's looked at a comp survey knows how complex and intricate they are, but we will discuss roles with leaders, talk about, how we're matching those jobs in the market, and then they'll understand how jobs are graded, what they're graded, and then we talk about how the employees are paid within those ranges. One of the things that I think we do that's particularly effective is the compensation team reviews every offer, meaning internal or external hire, or a job posting that's being filled, or an employee that's being promoted. Anyone at the manager level and above, compensation reviews that offer. And the reason we do that, we say, we're not the police here. We just want to look at, we do like a mini pay equity analysis on every single offer that goes out. And of course, there's, we have 17,000 employees. There's lots of offers. We can manage within the comp team for the grade, the manager levels and above. But then what we've provided to our talent acquisition team is a form that they can kind of do the same thing on all the other jobs. So it's pull all the peers in the position that you're hiring into. Look at their tenure, their time and job, race, gender. We want to do, again, a mini analysis on every offer that we're making, basically so we're not breaking what we fixed. We do regression analysis every year. We report out to the HRC of the board as to where we stand from a pay equity standpoint, and make sure that we've got everything fixed, if you will, but that we don't want offers to be going out all year long that might be creating inequities that we have to go back and fix later. So having said that, I'll just end with it's looking at transparency and pay equity every day. It's a culture, it's a front of mind thing. It's not something we do regression analysis once a year to kind of see where we are and fix a few things. It's really got to be, a living thing that we're keeping our eye on every single day.
Tim, thank you so much. And I absolutely agree with you that it has to be a living, breathing thing that happens kind of over and over and over again, year in and year out. So I wanted to just close by thanking all of our presenters today, and by thanking all of you who were able to take the time out to attend. And we hope that the rest of the week is easy breezy for everyone. It's been a short week, so hopefully that means it's been going by fast. But again, we want to thank the support that we receive from the City of Columbus, as well as from all of you. And so, like I had said earlier, please consider signing the Columbus Commitment if you've not already signed it. I do believe it is a powerful first step for an organization who's committed to pay equity and pay transparency. Also, please make sure to look forward to participating in the legislation that is going to be being put forward as the companion bill with the council member Barosa de Padilla. And please make sure to come back and check out our upcoming webinars. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the chat for us, and we will try to get back with you. And as we said earlier, we will be sending out the recording from today as well. So thank you. Please stay connected, and we hope everyone has a great rest of the afternoon.